that gender is also a very much a dimension of politics. So today we decided to talk about two very important ideologies, Islam and feminism. So this course is intended to go through the very complicated idea of feminism and also its compatibility with Islam. And so it's two very talked about ideologies, and lately there's been a lot of discussions on whether they can coexist or are they purely conflicting ideologies. So we decided to invite two very smart, very intelligent, very young women to talk about these issues, and these two people have been very vocal on this topic. So the first one is Zara Faris. She is a part of the Muslim Debate Initiative. She has talked extensively about liberalism and feminism, and she's also an alumnus of SOAS. Chair. The next speaker is Datin Paduka Marina Mahade. She's an advocate of feminism within an Islamic framework. She is also very active in humanitarian efforts such as HIV/AIDS, and also she's a board member of the Sisters in Islam Malaysia. Our moderator for today is the manager of gender in MPUK, Izzati Badro. She's the mastermind of this project. She has orchestrated and planned this project for many months. So I hope that today she has a lot of very interesting questions in store. Before we go on to the discussion, the format for today's event is 10 minutes introductory speech each, followed by about 30 minutes or so for the moderator to pose her questions. After a 5-minute short break, there will be an extensive Q&A session where anybody can come up and ask anything. And there will be a post-event informal chat with the speakers, so if you'd like to talk personally to them, then you can stay back after the event. Okay? Just like technical things, the prayer room is right beside this hall. The bathroom is downstairs, and it would be really nice if everybody silent or mutes their phone or just turn it off so it doesn't disturb the flow of the event. Alright.
Thank you, Nawal, for the warm introduction.
I'm just not going to use the mic because it disturbs the audio for our video recording. So I'm just going to project my voice. Okay, thank you, Nawal, for the introduction, the warm introduction. Just to note, Nawal is also the manager of Sociology of MPUK. We have a section under MPUK. So if anyone wants to talk to her, please do so. It has come to my attention that compatibility or conflicting ideas of Islam and feminism should be discussed in a mature setting. Islamic feminism, a phenomenon that derives internally with no obvious west or east fault line, appeared firstly in the countries where patriarchal Islamism is exercised widely. However, why do we need feminism if Islam is inherently self-directing? To what extent does Islam and feminism agree with each other? This topic unbolted a plethora of questions that many of us in this room keen to know. Hence, without further ado, I would just allow Datin Paduka Marina Mahade to give her introductory remark, and then followed by some questions.
Just give it a try.
Can we?
That's one.
So, right. Good evening, everyone. Sorry.
Yeah, if you want stands.
Oh, I see.
Or do you prefer?
No, I'll just.
Okay.
Fine. Good evening, everyone. First of all, let me thank MPUK for inviting me to come and speak at this session. It's really great to have this opportunity because the Malaysian students here will know at home I will never have this opportunity because I'm not allowed into any of the public universities. So if any of you came from any of the public universities in Malaysia, it's great to see you here. For some reason they all think I'm really dangerous, I don't know. Anyway, I just want to start by saying that I'm not a scholar. So if you're expecting a lecture where you can take notes for exams or whatever, I'm not the person. But I have had more than 20 years of experience working in the NGO field, in HIV/AIDS particularly, and that experience really has shaped the way I view things back home particularly, but also on the general issue of women's rights, and particularly in Islam. So let me talk to you a bit about the experience that has shaped my thinking. So as you know, I was president of the Malaysian AIDS Council for 12 years. Actually, it's been 10 years since I stepped down from there, but some people still think I'm president of MAC. But one of the things that I learned during those 12 years, working in a country like Malaysia, where most people are pretty religious, is that you cannot separate religion, you cannot neglect religion in our work for prevention, treatment, care, and support. And you think that this would be obvious to a lot of people, but it wasn't actually. I remember going to lots of international meetings where I would talk about, let's bring religious leaders into the work with HIV, and was met with very, very vehement opposition, mostly from people coming from countries such as the Middle East or from Latin America. And I used to be very puzzled by all this, and I realized that those countries really are quite patriarchal countries, very difficult, where they had a lot of problems with the church or problems with the religious authorities there. So never mind, Malaysia is Malaysia, we can, we don't have to follow other people. So I thought that, religious leaders had a big role to play in HIV, particularly to prevent the stigma and discrimination that people living with HIV suffered. So to cut a long story short, we actually did a lot of work, we at MAC did a lot of work in collaboration with people at JAKIM, the Islamic Development Department, in Prime Minister's Department, where we went around the country training a lot of religious leaders on HIV. And religious leaders, meaning everyone from imams, qadis, ketua kampung, village heads who very often had to minister to villagers and all that on HIV. So we went to train them on HIV/AIDS and found really good response. One, because they were already experiencing it at the ground level and they didn't know what to do. So doing this work around the country, we worked with JAKIM to develop a manual on Islam and AIDS, which brought in a lot of religious arguments for prevention, for care, for compassion, for support, for not stigmatizing and discriminating against people living with HIV. And it was a long process of working with with all these religious leaders. And for me, it was a very enlightening experience because my instinct that we had to bring in religious leaders was correct. We had to bring them in because they could do so much good. And what was enlightening for me is that we could, unlike those people that I met at overseas conferences, religion could be a very positive force for the work that we did, right? So that was one. So, there was one specific problem though that wasn't quite settled by the way we work, and that was the problem with women who were vulnerable to HIV. Most women in Malaysia, I mean, if any of you remember that, in Malaysia the HIV problem was mostly among drug users, who are mostly men, and who are mostly, sadly, Malay and Muslim. So their wives and partners were at particular risk of infection through sexual transmission from them, right? So we found that there was a really very specific problem in protecting these women from HIV, or in reducing their vulnerability to HIV. And it was not just about giving them information. Information you can give, how do you get HIV, how do you not get HIV, but how do they act on it, right? What's the point of talking to them about condoms? Because very often the people they are most at risk at was their own husbands. And how do you bring up this question without really creating a huge problem and possibly putting yourself at risk of being beaten up? Yeah? And how do you talk to them about abstinence? You can't talk to them about abstinence, they're married, right? So we had a lot of cases where these women would be running back to their mother saying, I'm really afraid I might get infected. My husband, I know, is on drugs. What do I do? And the mothers would say, no, you have to go back because you have to obey your husband. You can't say no to him. Now, I'm very sure that these mothers, if they knew the risk and if they knew what HIV meant, they would not so easily say that to their daughters, which just goes to show that you should educate everyone about HIV regardless of their actual risk. But this was a problem. This was a big problem for a lot of the women that we met. How do you protect them? So this was what. So I got to thinking, like, were these women doomed? Are these beliefs about their relationship with their husbands, is that correct? Or is there room to maneuver with this? So just as, when we work with Jakim to find like religious justifications for prevention, treatment, care, support, and all that, including that manual, where we found a lot of Quranic verses and things like that, I started to think like, okay, how can we protect these women from a religious point of view? Like, how do we counter this? And that's really how I became a Muslim feminist. Because I believe that if these Muslim women were made vulnerable by what they believe Islam said about how they should act with their husbands, then there was a problem. And I didn't believe that God would do that to women, that just purposely make them unable to protect themselves. That somehow didn't ring true to me because of what I believe about Islam. So with the help of various Islamic scholars, Prof. Hashim Kamali was one, Prof. Fatih Osman was one, we started to think about and reading various publications, including those published by my colleagues at CIS. I came to two conclusions. One was that the Quran is a wonderfully liberating book because if you read it, and you for yourself particularly, it emphasizes justice and equality over and over again. And so one of my favorite verses, it says that men and women are close of each other, which means we protect each other. So how does that gel with men, men not caring about infecting their wives, for instance? How is that protection? So that can't be right. So how can it be just if women were left to the mercy of infection from their own husbands? And if the Quran says that every man and woman is entitled to, has a right to bodily integrity, to dignity and all that, how can we, just because of biology, just that women have to be left to be infected? So this was one. Of course, men who are infected also deserve treatment, care, and support. I'm not arguing about that, but women very often suffered more from the stigma. Just a brief thing, very often women found they were infected through HIV tests when they are pregnant, because we have a prevention of mother-to-child treatment program. And very often, they are found to be pregnant, found to be infected first. And very often it's because they were infected by the husband, but the husband had not been tested yet. So very often, they were blamed for the infection. And we know lots of women will be thrown out of the families and everything because they were tested first. So that was a big issue. And secondly, if to be a feminist is to care about women's issues, not just about HIV, but also about violence against women, and laws and policies that discriminate against women at work, at home, in the courts, then the solutions for me can be found in the Quran. But what is needed, however, is for women to reclaim the right to find the answers in the Quran by themselves and not through others, especially if the others are men. Because I really think that the Quran's principles and ethics are for all time. And we have to, and it can respond to every situation, but not literally. It came in a certain time, meant to respond to certain situations at that time, but the situation has changed. So the question is, how can we apply the Quranic principles of justice and equality to the situation of Muslim women today? And I think we can, and that's why I think Islam and feminism are completely compatible. So I think I'll stop there first and let Sarah have a say, then we can carry on. Because I have a lot more to say about that. That's just, in brief, the story of how I came to this position.
Now we're going to proceed with Zara Harris with the introduction.
First of all, assalamu alaikum and greetings to everybody for coming, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me. I begin in the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful. Now, the title of this evening is Islam and Feminism, Compatible or Conflicting? First of all, can everybody hear me at the back? Okay, great, thank you. Now, the mere fact that some people decide to call themselves Muslim feminists is not really proof that Islam and feminism are compatible. And one of the greatest ironies, perhaps, is that such feminists regularly affirm through their own work that feminism and Islam are not compatible unless Islam changes to fit feminist ideas. Now, some feminist groups, like Sisters in Islam and Musawa, instead of reviving Islam, often you find them demanding reinterpretations, repudiations, or the reformation of Islam in order to actually align it with Western secular liberal beliefs. Now, For example, they openly advocate the cherry picking of prophetic traditions that they like, i.e. hadith, and rejecting those they don't like. So Keisha Ali, for example, some of you may have heard of her, she claims that contemporary believers are permitted to adopt hadith when it agrees with contemporary Western ethics, but to reject it when it contradicts them. So there's this cherry picking going on. Aisha Chowdhury, in one of Musawa's publications, justifies rejecting hadith that they do not like by stating that the Prophet, peace be upon him, was a patriarchal man who belonged and was comfortable in 7th century Arabia. And she asks readers to take advantage of the pliable nature of prophetic reports. And when it comes to Quranic interpretations, some of you may have heard of Amina Wadud and Asma Lamrabit. They also outrageously argue that the Islamic injunction for a wife to obey her husband in what is halal, obviously not in that particular circumstances which you referred to, contradicts the oneness of God, as they claim that obedience is for God alone. Now, if obedience to the husband is idolatry, then according to such feminists, a boy obeying his mother would also be idolatry. A citizen, being a law-abiding person, would also be idolatry. And a Muslim obeying the Prophet, peace be upon him, which the Quran specifically requires, would also be idolatry. Now, Amina Wadud, who is a founding member of Sisters in Islam, she went even further when she infamously said with regards to Quranic text, personally, I'm quoting, she says, personally, I've come to places where how the text says what it says is just plain inadequate or unacceptable, however much interpretation is enacted upon it. And she says further that when she disagrees with the Quranic text, she says, there is the possibility of refuting the text to talk back to even say no. So does this sound like feminists themselves think that Islam and feminism are compatible? Doesn't really sound like it. Now, they also claim, for example, that gender roles do not exist in Islam because of the principle of equality or musawa. Now, interestingly, the Quran doesn't actually use the word musawa or any of its derived forms, except when it's saying not equal are belief and disbelief. This is the only instance in which you'll find that this term used. Rather, the Quran recognizes that no two people, regardless of gender, are given the same provisions, blessings, or tests, and in the afterlife, similarly, people are ranked and rewarded differently. So people are treated with and promised justice in the Quran, not a blanket equality. It's not proposing a kind of communism. But due to its somewhat shallow thinking and assessing the worth of individuals in materialistic terms, what feminism ends up doing is dehumanizing the very sophisticated Islamic injunctions in the Quran that relate to family and marriage. And whilst it advocates intersectionality in diagnosing problems, it fails to appreciate the interconnectedness and the checks and balances that actually exist within the Sharia itself. And its individualistic worldview means it fails to look beyond the individual and appreciate the foresight that the Sharia has in preventing certain injustices. Now, this means that feminists who need to argue that Islam is male biased cannot really explain why in Islam a woman has a right over her husband's time, his money, and even his body. And so they cannot therefore also accept the Islamic rulings on inheritance, spousal obligations, rulings on family leadership, modesty, and so on. And by constantly demanding that Islam has to change, feminists are openly admitting that it is not compatible with Islam. So it's not me saying it, this is feminists saying it. But what exactly do they want Islam to change into? Now, feminists such as Asma Balas, Ziba Mir Husseini, and others openly write that they're trying to, and I quote, reconcile Islam with modernist conceptions of justice, feminist theories, Western conceptions of human rights, and contemporary Western ethics. In other words, they're not acting as interpreters of the text, but rather as secular liberal interpolators, in some ways missionaries. Now, instead of reviving classical Islamic understanding and inspiring creative liberators in the Muslim world, we see such feminists unfortunately trying to strip away the Islamic mechanics and safeguards for justice. And instead of helping Muslim society out from its post-colonial backwardness, which it is in and is facing a lot of problems because of, Such feminists seem instead to be trying to complete the colonial project by pushing for the full imitation of Western ideologies. Now, this is not compatibility, brothers and sisters. This is a forced marriage and followed by a forced conversion. Now, Amina Wadud also talked about the frustrations that Muslim feminists feel when they have to pretend to argue feminism from an Islamic perspective and not a secular liberal perspective. So she writes in her book, the executive director of Sisters in Islam, Zaina Anwar, once asked, why can't we say we are working for gender justice from a human rights perspective instead of our earlier claim of working for a gender-inclusive Islamic perspective? And Amina Wadud commented, quite honestly, I understand the frustrations. So in other words, feminists seem to want to bring Muslims towards secular liberalism in the same way that sometimes missionaries from other religions will use the Quran to try to bring Muslims to other religions. Now, where exactly do these secular liberal values lead us, if that's where they're trying to take us? So let's look at what they consider to be the utopia, their vision of what the West actually is. Now, in the UK, where has 100 years of feminism led to? It's led to a lot of unintended consequences. So today, women receive preferential treatment in the criminal justice system with lighter sentences, preferential domestic violence support and cancer research, despite statistics showing that men are often vulnerable at similar or higher rates. It's led to education gaps, with women excelling ahead of men at universities and in entry to employment. It's led to women being liable to pay alimony to ex-husbands in the event of divorce. And the individualistic denial of mutual legal rights and duties between men and women in marriage has led to a frustration and isolation for both genders, and it's led to rising divorce rates. Women are socially and economically compelled to work. It's not out of choice, and often socially compelled by the fashion industry and the media to dress in revealing clothing and sexualize their appearance in order to be validated by society. Men can sleep with women without any legal commitment, and so many are now turning away from marriage, and women have to provide for themselves. So, if anything, it could be argued that men might be happier here in the West than they would be in these so-called patriarchal Muslim countries. Domestic violence also continues to exist in shocking proportions, including against men and including amongst lesbian couples as well. And men and women both continue to be judged according to their gender rather than their merit. So is this what Muslim feminists are proposing or advocating for the Muslim world? Now, going back to the text, we encounter the fundamental problem with feminist interpretation. If we point to the Quran or Hadith as evidence for why Islam and feminism conflict, many feminists will simply reply, those texts are metaphorical, they're not to be understood literally, or the texts are historical, they're only for that time, they're not for this time, despite those verses being mubin, which means clear or unambiguous. Now, seeing as the Quran and Hadith, which I've talked about this evening, are fundamental to Islam, and seeing how Muslim feminists make excuses for rejecting these texts today or openly admitting to saying no to them, simple common sense would dictate that Islam and feminism are conflicting. But seeing how Muslim feminists seem to remain unfazed by this, I propose that we need a falsification test for this topic. And that is that if feminists don't consider the Quran and Hadith conflicting with Islam to mean that Islam conflicting with feminism, to mean that Islam conflicts with feminism, then what would be sufficient evidence to show that Islam and feminism are conflicting? If it's not the Quran and Hadith, what else is there left to show conflict? What evidence would they accept without making these excuses? Now, I invite you all this evening to think about what conflict would look like, and other than overly wishful thinking, have we not already witnessed this conflict between Islam and feminism? Thank you for your time.
I'm going to pose questions from our four subtopics, which is Islamic feminism, Quran and Hadith, polygamy, and hijab. I'm going to pose each panel with one question on the same topic, but not same question. And the order to answer the question is according the order of me posing the question. So on Islamic feminism, I'll start with Zara. If Islam is all encompassing and just to women and men, why are all the prophets, most imam, clerics, judges, as well as you see in practices, for example, legal structure, four women are equal to one man as a witness? You know, this evidence are very much male-centric, and does this not show that female are subjugated in Islam?
So I guess this question is something that we hear frequently. Why do you need, for example, four male witnesses who attest to certain things, or four, equals? Well, this is coming to my next point actually. Why do you need two female witnesses to equal one male witness? Now, if you are familiar with a lot of the rulings in Islam, you'll know that there are situations in which you need four male witnesses to equal one female witness. For example, in accusations of zina or fornication, if you have someone accusing the woman, they need four male witnesses to equal that one woman's testimony. So there are many scenarios in which it depends on the circumstance, it depends on the situation. In matters, for example, of childbirth or things which women at the time tended to be more familiar with, you didn't need two female witnesses. It was just sort of, one female witness, and sometimes you might even need two male witnesses. With regards to when you did need two female witnesses, this was purely in relation to commercial transactions. So the verse where you'll find this is purely in relation to commercial transactions. So it says to the people, when you are engaging in a transaction, be sure to write it down. That's the first thing. So it's giving kind of the completion requirements for doing any kind of contract. And because women at the time were not as involved in commercial and transactional affairs, it said, to have two female witnesses if you can't find two men, so you have one male and two women. Now, I think the problem that people encounter when they hear about, why do you need two women to equal one man? There's a lot of misconceptions about Islam's opinion on women's intellectual capacity, or what Islam says about women's intellectual capacity. Now, in Islam, a woman can be in any position of authority. There's only one that you can't be in, and that's the role of the caliph, for example. I'll explain what I mean if you'll allow. So a woman in Islam can be a judge, she can be an advisor to a ruler, she can be a teacher, she can be in any role, and there are plenitude of examples from the prophetic tradition and ever since then. You had an advisor to the caliph, who the caliph very much valued her opinion, and you had the woman who was in authority of the marketplace, so she was basically the regulator of the market, a very public arena, yet she was a woman, she was valued for her intellect, and women were not held back from these roles, and it also wasn't considered something special that, a woman is doing this role. It was taken as a given. Why wouldn't she do this role? It wasn't glamorized. It was kind of socialized norm at the time. Now, the only reason that, for example, the woman can't be in the role of the caliph is a very it's a practical reason. The first is that the ruler is essentially not anyone special. It doesn't matter who the ruler is. The system is agreed upon by the people. The ruler is there purely to administer the role. So this idea that somehow putting a woman in the position will change the way things work doesn't really translate. For example, in Pakistan, where you didn't even have an Islamic system, you had Muslims, and it's very much a secular country. But having, a female ruler didn't improve conditions for women at all. Similarly, in other countries, having a female ruler alone does not improve the conditions. What matters is the governance and the system that is agreed upon, and the ruler is purely the administrator. So the first thing is, we shouldn't be obsessed with, why can't women be rulers? Because it's irrelevant. If you agree on what needs to be done, it doesn't really matter. And secondly, the role of the caliph as a male is purely because as the male, they would also be the commander of sort of the army and be expected to go into battle. And so because women are not legally obliged to be conscripted in Islam, you're not legally obliged to fight, although you could do so voluntarily if you were in a Muslim country and they had an army. However, because it's not an obligation on you, the state can't also call on you to be a leader. So it's purely an exemption rather than a restriction. However, as I mentioned, because the woman can be in the capacity of an advisor, and because who the ruler is doesn't really matter, it's a non-issue. It's been generally a non-issue for Muslims.
But we don't see that translated in a very dominated Muslim society, whereas women are being positioned, no, you don't lead, let the men lead. And then it's so ingrained that it affects a lot.
Yeah.
The public.
Yeah.
So that concerns a lot of people. So what do you have to say?
So the sister's bringing up very acute and correct observation that in the Muslim world today, this is not what we see. And this is correct, this is not what we see. So you know how I mentioned in my presentation about how the Muslim world today is essentially a post-colonial mess. It is really a mess. And this is not how Islam is supposed to be practiced. There is interest banking, there is corruption, there is lying, there is, people struggling. Their only currency is so-called honor and reputation. It's become very tribal, it's become very unlearned. It is not attached to the classical traditions anymore. It's come very far from that. And I think we shouldn't look to the Muslim world as an example for how Islam should be. We should look at Islam and its historical practice, its successful practice in the past, for how to re-implement this. And in the Muslim countries, in the Muslim world, that is what needs to be revived. The classical understandings, reconnecting people in a lively and dynamic way to the classical scholarship, and making sure that the governance and all the infrastructure is put in place properly so that those things can be seen through, so that people's rights and duties can be protected, and so that you are not having people being exploited for, you owe me this duty, do this, while, everything else is, going to hell. It doesn't really make sense. So, for example, how did the Arab Spring start in the Muslim world? It was a man who was so frustrated with the political and economic condition and circumstance. He was so frustrated, one of hundreds of thousands, because he couldn't provide for his family with honor and dignity. He was just trying to make a living and provide for, his wife and children and family. He was so frustrated at the tyranny and corruption that he set himself on fire. Now, we didn't say this is a men's rights issue. We didn't say this is a family issue. We recognize that this is anarchy in the Muslim world. There is tyranny and there is corruption. So we can't look at the Muslim world and isolate problems and look at them individually. We have to look at the bigger picture in order to provide a holistic solution and make sure that the groundwork is there, rather than the piecemeal implementation of one or two implementations. It doesn't really work like that.
I'll get back to you before with Marina. So my question on Islamic family, this embracing feminism means we have to assess the entire Islamic jurisprudence, or in other words, usul fiqh, the practices, conventions. Do you think if we adhere to feminism, Islamic feminism per se, do we need to change some means of practicing Islam?
Well, no, I don't think so, because I think Islam by itself, there is no problem. And by the way, it's very interesting. I agree with everything that Zara has just said, because it's absolutely true that it shouldn't be an issue who is there and all that. But there is the who is the leader, or who is the teacher, or whoever. It shouldn't be an issue. But there is this thing called unconscious bias. I think you've heard of it, where people are so ingrained into thinking that only certain people can be certain things. And we've just had an interesting, I don't know whether you all follow Malaysian news, but we just had this interesting thing where a couple of years ago, the Malaysian National Fatwa Council said that women could be Sharia judges. Now this is partly a practical, practical thing. Because, as you know, there are more female students in our universities than there are male. There are 70% now, and that includes in Islamic studies. So there are actually more women coming out, graduating from Islamic studies than there are men. So naturally, they are going to go into the religious departments and all that, and they're going to go up the ranks. And after a while, the most qualified people to be judges are the women. So the National Fatwa Council said, yeah, it's fine, for them to be judges. And so a couple of years ago, they appointed the first 2 women Sharia judges. And they announced that we've just appointed them. The men all freaked out because like they didn't realize that it was happening, I think. And then they immediately said, oh, okay, they can be judges, but they can't be judges in the divorce cases because they might be biased. Why? We don't know, you know, but it was kind of too late already because they were already appointed, they had the letters of appointment and all that. So anyway, so that was okay. And then since then there have been more judges. But recently, a couple of days ago actually, the head of the National Fatwa Council commented that some states are still refusing to appoint women as Sharia court judges. And he wanted to know why, because they are very qualified, they are higher, what do you call it, CPGA? You know, they're very American style, I don't understand. But anyway, better than the guys, and so why can't they appoint these women as Sharia court judges? So today, he particularly pointed out Selangor State, which is Jais, you know, and Mais, very problematic state. I'll go into that later. But today, Mais, the head of Mais, Majlis Agama Islam Selangor, came out and said, yeah, we'll appoint them, but only in family matters and things like that, not in the criminal cases, Sharia criminal, under the Sharia Criminal Offences Act. Fine, you know, fine. At least they considered that much. It was better than from zero. So, you know, there is that bias where it's not necessarily Islamic, as you pointed out. There's no real reason to not have these women because they are qualified, but yet they didn't want to appoint them until now. They're being pushed by a man, by the way, not any of us. So, you know, now they're being pushed into a position where they have to appoint women Sharia court judges. And you get a lot of these cases all over the time. Sometimes not even just from men, but also from women. Like we had this Adun, state assemblywoman from Perak, who said that women could not be Menteri Besar or Chief Minister of the state because there are a lot of religious functions that she has to perform with the Sultan, and she couldn't do that because she's a woman. Now, in the job description of being Chief Minister of a state, I'm not sure that religious functions with the Sultan is number one. I'm sure it's about administering the state properly, making sure it's developed, and ensuring that, you know, the well-being of people in the state, etc., etc., which is pretty much gender neutral. You know, it is you know, as you said, it's about governance, right? It's whether you're going to be a good governor or not. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female. But there's this woman saying that you couldn't, just because you can't perform these religious duties, which take up maybe, you know, 5% of your time as MB. So, you know, it's things like this. You know, where does this come from? Where does this type of thinking come from? Is it Islamic? In fact, I have a tendency to agree with Zara that actually it comes from a colonial past that we haven't quite shaken off. Because, you know, a lot of our laws, Malaysia, the codified religious laws actually came from the Brits. The Brits came and codified our laws. Before that, actually, women in the Malay Peninsula, of course when they came over 100-something years ago, it was not Malaysia yet. Women had a lot of rights. They could go and complain to the village head if they had a problem with their husband, their own property, etc., etc. Then the Brits came, and as Brits do, what they like to do, they like to codify laws. Anyway, they like to write it all down, right? So they decided that, okay, all these customary laws that are out there, we have to put it down. We have to write it down. Now, when they wrote it down, don't forget, this was in Victorian times. Some of the things that, when they tried to codify it, they brought in their own beliefs and biases and all that into it. How many of you watched Downton Abbey? Guy pula. You don't watch Downton Abbey, you know the premise of Downton Abbey, right? The premise is that this guy, Lord Grantham, has got all these daughters who they own this wonderful mansion, right? This beautiful mansion. It's very important who these daughters marry, right? Because in Victorian times, when a woman marries, her property goes to the husband, right? So, in our country, in Malaysia, that was not the case. But the colonial officers who were codifying our laws couldn't believe this. Like, how can a woman administer her own property? So it must go to the husband. So they couldn't quite believe this. And today, you know, one of the things that all of us Muslim women grow up with is that if whatever our fathers give us, whatever our family gives us, you know, our property, when we get married, it's still ours, right? So that has been in our family laws for the longest time. Up till 1984, we had the best family laws in the world. And that was one of the things that was pretty much central, you know, for Muslim women, that we own our own properties. But now it has been changed in the name of gender neutrality, so that now, if a Muslim couple gets divorced in Malaysia, that property that you bring to the marriage, which should remain yours, it's counted as harta sepencarian, which is in English? Matrimonial property. But you can guess. Matrimonial property, and then you split up, you have to divide it by half. So what you bring, so this was the Lord Grantham problem, right? Suddenly you have it there. And this is not, you know, and this is a problem because it comes from a bias that translates into law and public policy. And then that's a big problem for a lot of women now in Malaysia. I mean, we can talk about the theoretical. The theory is great. You know, the theory is great. Muslim women, when Islam came, they were entitled to have their own property. But now suddenly, they have to give it up because of these laws that are written down. So, you know, I blame the Brits. But the thing is that there are some people now defending this type of laws and saying Islamic, we cannot change. But the fact is that it's been changed several times. 1984, we really had great Muslim family laws in Malaysia. I can't speak for other countries. But it has been changed over time so that we Muslim women actually have lost a lot of it. And the trouble is, we live in a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country. And we have a constitution that is supposed to apply to every citizen in Malaysia. But the fact is that for non-Muslim women, they have been gaining rights over these years, while we have been losing. And that is, you know, doesn't gel to me. If you're equal under this constitution, but you have different rights, and we are losing these rights. It is not. It's actually, I think, un-Islamic. You know, what else can I say? Because there is no justice for Muslim women. And I can tell you so many stories from our experiences of the women that come to us who are really suffering. It's you know, when it translates into law and public policy, when it's implemented, then human biases and beliefs and all that come into play, and how it plays out in real life causes a lot of unhappiness, causes a lot of injustice, etc.
Could I add to this something? So I'm glad that you agree that, you know, the inheritance law should, you know, the Islamic inheritance law is kind of better. But I guess what concerns me is, I was looking, for example, at the, maybe you could comment, if you want, you don't have to comment, but I was looking at, for example, the Musawa, which is one of the organizations to, you know, cultivate sort of feminism and stuff. I was looking at the toolkit and the framework that they have on the website, and some of the aims said, you know, equal rights, including like gender egalitarianism, including equal division of property, and they should have the same property rights as one another. And I found that a bit alarming compared with what you've explained today, because what does that mean? Does that mean where in Islam women get, you know, they get to keep all their property, but they only get half inheritance? Would equalizing it, are those individuals calling then that men should also get to keep all of their property and not have to provide? Or are they saying that, you know, women have to be the providers? Or are they saying that, you know, both parties get to keep their own property and not provide for each other? So this kind of thing, I think, is problematic and concerning. So if these are the kinds of proposals and values being put out there, I don't see how this will help some of the problems that you've just mentioned. So I agree that, you know, a lot of these the laws and attitudes are from a Victorian era, sort of transported over, you know, thinking that the whole world needs this when it really doesn't. It did similar things in Malaysia, preventing women, for example, from you know, becoming doctors, whereas they used to before. Whereas the, you know, the colonial you know, guys would come along and say, you know, our women make do with male doctors, you can do the same. It's been the same throughout the Muslim world. So I think the response to this shouldn't be, let's, you know, for example, with regards to property and inheritance, I don't think it should be as what some of these organizations are, you know, honestly saying, which is that it should be divided and equal property rights for both, because that's exactly what you know, has been the cause of some of these problems in the first place. So, I don't know, that's kind of, you know, I find it a bit striking that the comparison between what you've said, which is nice, but what, for example, some of the policies and aims of the organizations differ quite a bit.
Actually, they don't differ. It's what, you know, women have these rights and men have the right.